Hello there! This lecture is all about work stress. And I think this lecture will probably hit home for a lot of you who have experienced some of the things that I'm going to be discussing, like work-family conflict and role ambiguity and workplace aggression and sexual harassment and things that a lot of us have experienced in the workplace. I'm also excited to present this lecture to you because this is actually my area of research. So a lot of my research is focused on job insecurity and workplace aggression and sexual harassment. So you'll actually see some of my research cited at the end of this lecture. So I hope you enjoy learning about work stress, and I hope that you can't relate to everything in this because you don't have an inherently stressful job. So the first bit of this lecture will cover the foundational theoretical models of job stress. So it's really important for you to understand what a lot of researchers use as a frame of reference when they're making their hypotheses. So there's a ton of theories about stress, and I'm going to cover the theories that are most often cited in industrial organizational psychology research. Then we'll shift focus to some common stressors that are studied in IO psychology research. So looking at role stress, injustice, which includes fairness perceptions about procedures and distribution of resources and interactions with your colleagues. Then we'll look at interpersonal cruelty, so workplace aggression and sexual harassment. And then job insecurity, so the fear of job loss. Then we'll end with coping with stress. So some of the ways that managers can help alleviate problems that arise after the announcement of a layoff or when employees have a lot of job insecurity. And then I'll talk about ways that you can cope with stress from the organizational perspective and from the individual perspective. So you guys are about to be presented with a bunch of theoretical models of job stress. And you'll see that although each one is different in its own way, there is some consistencies across all these different models. So one of these consistencies is that perception matters, right? So stress is in the eye of the beholder. So a lot of these theories suggest that the impact of stress depends on an individual's perceptions. And there's many objective stressors that only have a detrimental impact on people who view them negatively. A lot of these theories also suggest that people strive to cope with job stress. So coping is usually a piece of one of these theories. So people can cope through action, so using problem-focused coping, or through changing the situation by reevaluating the stress or using emotion-focused coping. You can also use emotion-focused coping to devalue the cause of stress and maybe try to care less about the stressful situation. Now, these models also suggest, for the most part, that perception is what determines coping. So if you feel powerless, right? That's your perception, then you're probably going to use more emotion-focused coping because you're seemingly unable to change the situation. Whereas if you feel like you have some control or the ability to change your environment, you'd be more likely to use problem-focused coping. So the conservation of resources theory is one of the oldest but also commonly cited theories about job stress. And according to this theory, individuals seek to create and maintain personal characteristics that they value. So some examples would be like mastery of your job or increasing your self-esteem. Individuals also seek to create and maintain social circumstances that increase rewards and prevent loss. So for instance, job security would be a social circumstance that would prevent you from being afraid of losing your job and not being able to support your family. So tenure is an excellent example of a resource, right? Because you have pretty solid job security at that point. Now, this theoretical model also suggests that resources are the single unit necessary for understanding stress. So it suggests that environmental circumstances often threaten or cause a depletion in people's resources. And this loss can be instrumental, so like the loss of money due to unemployment, something that's actually tangible, or symbolic loss. Instead of instrumental loss, it could be symbolic. So like the loss of status due to unemployment, right? You don't feel so good about yourself. So there's many different types of resources, but according to this model, there are four kinds of resources that result in stress. And keep in mind, this stress can either be positive or negative, and it can result to either a gain or loss of resources. So again, there's different types of resources, and I'll go through each one individually. So object resources are something that has status or value because of its rarity or expense. So like socioeconomic status or having rare art. Conditions are valued and sought after conditions or roles, and they have stress resistance potential. So like tenure, for example, as I mentioned before, that's a condition that can have stress resistance potential. I'm not as fearful about my job security once I have tenure. There's also personal characteristics that are some resources. So if you have a certain personal orientation to the world, that generally aids in the resistance of stress, right? So maybe if you have a positive sense of self or high self-efficacy, then you'll be more resistant to stress. Now, energies are a little bit different from personal characteristics, and these aid in acquiring other kinds of resources. So it's not as much about being resistant to stress, but it's about the ability to gain a resource surplus. So knowledge and time and money, right, are all important things, especially if you want to be successful in the workplace. You have to gain knowledge, you have to have time for your family and your work to have balance in your life, and you need to have money just for basic survival. Now, according to this theory, coping is really all about resource replacement. So it's about shifting the focus of your attention or reevaluating resources or replacing those resources. So resource replacement can be direct, so like getting a job, or it can be symbolic, so spending time with people who maybe boost your self-esteem and make you feel better about your life situation. So using resource replacement is more of a, problem-focused coping, but using resources to cope with loss is stressful in of itself, so you must consider that. Now, something called a loss spiral occurs when people with very few resources can't offset their loss or recover. So then they're vulnerable to future loss. So if you lose your job, then it's more difficult to get another job in the future, especially if you were fired because you have that on your job record. Then if you have a gap in your employment, it's even more stressful, and it can create just this downward spiral of not having as many prospects as you'd like. Now, some people will cope through shifting their focus of attention if they don't really feel like they can replace their resources. So maybe they reinterpret the threat as a challenge to overcome, and then they feel more motivated to overcome it. Also, people can cope by reevaluating their resources. So maybe they just reevaluate the value of their resources in an effort to stop caring so much. So this is the most simple strategy, but the value of resources, if you devalue them constantly and you stop caring, you may not be as successful because you won't be as motivated. So it's kind of dangerous to do that. Now, conservation of resources theorists see psychological stress as a reaction to the environment in which either there's a threat of a resource loss, an actual resource loss, or a lack of gain following resource investment. So for instance, if you start a business and you're making money but not as much as you had hoped, you could still experience this perceived resource loss. So this theory suggests that if there's not a perceived or actual resource loss, then people will just gain resources to prevent or buffer the effects of future loss. So some people say it's nice to strive to have 6 months worth of salary saved in your savings account just in case of emergencies. Or, you can use a high status job to make connections that lead to additional opportunities and more resources to prevent future stress. So slightly more recent models of work stress start to emphasize perceptions, whereas the conservation of resources theory was very simplistic and just said, hey, if you're losing resources or you feel like you're losing resources, then you'll have to cope with this stress. So this is Lazarus's transaction model of stress, and this suggests that stress is like a transaction, as the name implies. And this transaction is a situation where the employee influences the work environment, and in turn, the work environment influences the employee. So Lazarus believed that stress was a result of perceived threat, harm, or challenge. Again, perceived threat, harm, or challenge. So harm really just refers to damage that's already occurred. So for instance, job loss. Threat is all about anticipated harm that makes you feel in danger, defensive, or self-protective. So like job insecurity. Challenge is a high demand situation that requires effort. And it's important to note that challenging situations can typically result in positive stress. And in the right dose, challenges often lead to enthusiastic, engaged, and fulfilled employees. So if the person feels that they have stake or something to lose from the harmful, threatening, or challenging situation, then they consider options for dealing with the stress. Or in other words, they figure out how they need to cope with the stress. So there's different types of coping. Again, problem versus emotion focused. So for problem focused coping, according to this model, employees would seek information about what needs to be done. Then they could change their behavior or change the environment or maybe do both. And problem focused coping, again, only arises when the person thinks they can control the situation through their own efforts. So emotion focused or cognitive focused coping kicks in when a person feels out of control and that they don't really have the ability to change the environment. So emotion focused coping is really geared towards regulating the stress through ignoring or becoming apathetic to the situation, or maybe even denying that there's a problem at all. Also, you can use positive thinking as an emotion focused coping, right? Trying to think about the good aspects of the situation and seeing things as a challenge instead of a threat. Now, the transactional attributional model of stress takes the transactional model a bit further. So this adds to Lazarus's model by explicitly including causal attributions of whether or not the situation is controlled or uncontrolled or external versus internal. Also, this model explicitly includes the emotions that result from those causal attributions. So are those employees feeling guilt, shame, frustration, or anger? Now, according to this model of stress, those who experience stress and situations that they personally have control over feel like their problems are due to a lack of effort, which then results in guilt. So, everybody feels like, oh, problem focused coping is such a good thing, but maybe this negative affective response is what's contributing to problem focused coping, and that should be examined as well. So again, this guilt tends to motivate that person and change the situation. So the outcome, at the face of it, looks good. So maybe, for instance, someone would get a bad performance review, and this would make the employee feel guilty for their lack of effort. So then they'll work harder to avoid future guilt and embarrassment and get a better performance appraisal. Now, people tend to experience shame, according to this model, if they experience a stressful situation that they could have control over, but they lack the ability to fix it. So then they would feel ashamed and tend to emotionally cope with the shame. So a really good example of this would be drug use, right? So a person who is addicted to drugs really probably wants to stop, but they can't, and that can result in a feeling of shame. Now, according to this theory, people become angry when there are unreasonable demands or a poor work environment that could be improved if management was willing to make changes. So it could be controlled, it's not under their control, but the people who are in control choose not to do anything about it. Imagine, that would make me angry as well. So although these employees feel angry, they also feel helpless, so they have to focus on minimizing their anger and use emotion-focused coping. Finally, according to this model, people are frustrated when the stressful situation cannot be controlled just simply due to a lack of resources or bad luck. So this frustration also results in emotion-focused coping because, again, feeling helpless. Now, it's important to note that this model is cyclical, such that coping impacts the environment, and then the changes to the environment have an impact on employees, and then the process starts all over again. So after the transactional attributional model of stress was released, some researchers criticized it. So they suggested that assuming that all people make internal or external causal attributions is inaccurate. Researchers suggested that the very occurrence of an attribution may actually be a critical individual difference that should be considered in of itself. And the critics believe that there should be more of a focus on objective stressors, so things that are observed in the environment and that are measured by a third party, not self-report. So they believe there should be more of a focus on objective stressors versus just appraisals or perceptions or self-reports. They also believe that some stressors may be more hidden and thus difficult to measure objectively, so like role conflict and social stressors. But other stressors are more objective, like organizational interruptions such as layoffs or broken equipment or labor disputes, and that those objective stressors that lend themselves to observation should be included in studies of the stress process. So they don't completely discount perceptions, but they think it's important to look at the direct effects of objective environment or objective encounters. Now remember in the motivation lecture we talked about engagement, and burnout is essentially the antithesis of engagement, and you even see at the bottom right corner of this model disengagement right there. So this is a model geared towards burnout, not necessarily engagement, and this is called the Job Demands Resources Model of Burnout, or the JDR model for short. So the JDR model focuses on objective job conditions. So the critics of the transactional attribution model will be happy. So it includes these objective job conditions and pretty much ignores perceptions. But it's important to note that job demands and job resources are typically measured using self-report measures, not through objective indicators. So researchers using this model are actually usually measuring perceived job demands and perceived job resources. However, this model was validated using both objective and subjective self-report ratings of the working conditions that were measured. And actually, the researchers found that the relationship between self-report and objective ratings was not really strong. So there wasn't a strong relationship between what was being observed by a third party and what was being perceived by employees, especially for job demands. Those perceptions weren't matching up. So they suggest that maybe people are more sensitive to demands placed on them, and some are more receptive to the resources. So, again, individual differences in perceptions lead to that lack of relationship between self-report and objective measures of job demands and resources. So if we look at this model, you see several demands and resources, and I will go through each one of these briefly. So under demands, you see physical workload. So this is just about how taxing or draining is the physical aspect of the work and the work environment. Then time pressure is just about having enough time to perform tasks. Contact with customers is really just wondering how demanding your customers are. Unfavorable shift work would be schedules that are physically and emotionally draining, or maybe just schedules that are difficult to get used to. I know third shift schedules are usually linked to a lot of negative outcomes. Another demand would be the physical environment. So down to the temperature, the light conditions, the noise, the design of the workplace, and even the quality of tools and materials. Now shifting down to job resources. So feedback would be just getting enough information about the quality of your performance. Rewards is really geared towards feeling that performance is rewarded properly, right? So think about the equity theory of motivation and the fairness of rewards. Decision making is all about wondering if employees feel like they have a voice in decision making and if they have a chance to participate in making those decisions. Then job security is just about asking, do employees feel that the threat of losing their job is very low? If so, then they have job security. And then finally, supervisor support. So how closely does the supervisor work with employees, and how much does their supervisor help them be better performers? So looking at the job demands resources model of burnout, you can see that it suggests that the development of burnout follows two separate processes. So in the first process, there's a demanding aspect of the work environment, like extreme job demands. And this really leads to this constant overtaxing, and in the end, it leads to exhaustion. And exhaustion just reflects feeling emotionally drained or feeling that tasks are unmanageable and maybe needing longer times for rest and just feeling really worn out. Then in the second process, a lack of resources complicates your ability to meet job demands, and this leads to withdrawal behavior. So the long-term consequence of this withdrawal is disengagement from work. And employees who experience disengagement tend to feel that their jobs are less interesting. They can even become disgusted with the tasks associated with their job and essentially tend to just devalue their work. So, to summarize, the JDR model assumes that job demands are most predictive of feelings of exhaustion, whereas lacking job resources is predictive of disengagement from work. It's important to note that the relative contribution of specific job demands and resources to explaining burnout may vary across occupations because job demands and access to job resources are different in different occupations. However, this model was validated in a bunch of different occupational groups. So they looked at people who work with people, like teachers and nurses. They examined this model with people who work with things, so production line workers, and people who work with information. So they also looked at air traffic controllers and control room operators. And time again, this model was supported. Now, subsequent research has kind of tweaked this model. I'm assuming that they analyzed data and found a relationship between job demands and disengagement and job resources and exhaustion and adapted this model for their own purposes. But this is still the original model that is most often cited. The vitamin model was published in 2009, and this model has several different elements to it. So the first element is the concept that subjective well-being is two-dimensional, so involving elements of arousal and pleasure. High arousal situations typically result in more action, like problem-focused coping from the transactional models. So if there's a pleasant and exciting situation, or a situation that has high arousal and high pleasure, this will result in the highest levels of happiness, engagement, and performance because employees are intrinsically enthusiastic. Now, threatening situations, or those situations that have high arousal and low pleasure, tend to result in lower levels of well-being, lower performance, and even counterproductive work behaviors like theft or sabotage. Then, low arousal situations typically result in less action and more affective responses, like emotion-focused coping from the transactional models. Pleasant and peaceful situations, so those with low arousal and high pleasure, tend to result in a state of relaxation and wellness, whereas experiencing loss or a low arousal, low pleasure situation tends to result in inaction due to depression or hopelessness or feeling discouraged. Now, according to the vitamin model, subjective well-being has 3 levels of scope. So it's two-dimensional and it has 3 levels of scope. So the first level is context-free. So just your general health, maybe your general community, right? So not tied to a really specific group. Domain-specific well-being is tied to a specific environment. So your job environment or your home life or maybe your marital situation specifically. Then facet specific is even more narrow. So looking at specific aspects of the domains. So maybe how satisfied you are with your salary within your job environment, or maybe how happy you are with your sex life within your marriage. Now, according to the vitamin model, appraisal judgments depend on personal benchmarks and also on comparisons. So I'll go through each of these personal benchmarks and comparisons separately. So again, the appraisal of pleasure or arousal depends on these things, according to this model. So one of the first benchmarks is personal salience, or the importance of role membership, the attractiveness of the tasks and job characteristics, and maybe even growth needs strength, if you remember that concept from the job characteristics model of employee motivation. So another basis for appraisal is novelty. So asking yourself if the situation is unusual or if it's routine. So unusual or unexpected situations tend to result in more arousal, whereas continued exposure to a situation tends to reduce its potential to have an impact on your actions and emotions. And that's called habituation. You just become habituated to the stressor and it no longer has a strong impact on you. Self-efficacy also impacts your appraisal of job characteristics because it's all about considering whether or not your performance is effective in the situation. Comparisons are also important to attributions of stress and job characteristics. So people can compare themselves with the expected situation to see if their expectations were met. They can compare themselves with other people. And it's important to note that when you compare yourselves with other people, there's both downward and upward social comparison. So downward social comparison is the tendency to compare yourself to people in a situation that is worse than yours. So you're doing this in an effort to feel better about yourself and happier in general by looking at those who are worse off than you. Now, upward social comparison is the opposite of downward social comparison. So this occurs when you compare yourself with people who are doing better than you are. And although this tends to make you feel worse about yourself, doing upward social comparison has the potential to motivate you to strive for more. Now, people also judge their attributions based on comparisons with other times, or in other words, temporal judgments. So people ask themselves whether or not they are progressing towards their goals, and if they think their situation will get worse or better. So, in other words, if people have something to look forward to, then they experience happiness. War's vitamin model is the first major model of work stress that explicitly examines the magnitude or amount of demands, resources, and stressors. Although past research has suggested that a moderate amount of stress results in improvements in performance and that too much feedback, rewards, and control can be detrimental to employees, the majority of past theories imply a linear relationship between stress and outcomes. Or in other words, the greatest levels of well-being and performance occur in the absence of stress, and the lowest levels of performance occur in extremely stressful situations. Now, the vitamin model of job stress emphasizes the non-linear relationship between work stress and employee attitudes, perceptions, and behaviors. So War suggested that job characteristics impact business in a non-linear way, like vitamins in the body. So in other words, too much of a good thing can be harmful. Also, War suggests that moderate levels of something that may be stressful can be beneficial. So the various patterns of relationships between job characteristics and well-being depend on the facet of happiness that's being studied, or the facet of well-being. So there's also some different characteristics that can lead to the additional decrement that you see in the second graph, and then a different set of variables that can lead to a constant effect that you see in the third graph. So the variables that result in additional decrement tend to be intrinsic job characteristics, and they tend to result in an additional decrement to performance after they reach a certain point. So there's something called the Yerkes-Dodson law from 1908, and this suggests that increased arousal can help improve performance, but only up to a certain point. So once arousal becomes excessive or reaches a plateau, performance actually diminishes. So in other words, according to the Yerkes-Dodson law, performance will increase with stress until an optimal level is reached, after which performance declines. So think about the anxiety that you experience before an exam. So this is one example of how the Yerkes-Dodson law operates. So there's an optimal level of stress that'll help you focus on studying and focus on the test and remember the information that you studied. But too much test anxiety can impair your ability to concentrate and thus make it more difficult for you to remember correct answers and do well in the exam. So according to the vitamin model, variables that result in an additional decrement to performance at higher levels include control. So I've mentioned before, there's a certain degree of control is good, but having too much is not good. Opportunity for skill use. So you want to make sure that you're giving people the optimum level of challenge in their job, because if they have not enough opportunity for skill use or too much, then they won't have as high of well-being or job performance. Also looking at environment or task variety. So if somebody has too many tasks to do, they're going to be overwhelmed. They won't be as high a level of well-being or high level of performance. But on the opposite end, if they don't have any variety, they're going to be bored. Also, environmental clarity. So some clarity is good, but too much clarity could look like being micromanaged. Interpersonal contact. So being pretty lonesome isn't good for your well-being, but being overwhelmed with people isn't either. And then organizational goals. So if you have no goals to meet, then you're probably not going to be very high performing, and you probably won't have a whole lot of well-being because you're not getting a sense of fulfillment from your job. But again, on the other end, if there's too many organizational goals, then you're overwhelmed and you also have low well-being, low performance. Now, according to the vitamin model, other variables have an impact on well-being in a constant effect. So these are usually due to more extrinsic job characteristics, and they tend to result in better performance. But once a person becomes comfortable or reaches a desirable level of comfort or status, then additional resources no longer improve performance. So for instance, if you know that the final grades for the class are entered as a letter grade with a maximum of an A, right? No A pluses. And you already have a 94%, so you'd be receiving an A. You probably wouldn't benefit from extra credit, right? So it's not going to really help you at all. You're not going to work harder and put forth the extra effort for extra credit if you're already at a comfortable grade. So variables that result in a constant effect include those that you see on the screen. So think about money, right? So when you're really, really broke, money is going to be a strong motivator. But then once you reach a certain level of comfort, additional money isn't going to be that impactful. Same with physical security, right? If you have low security, then you're going to have low well-being. But once you feel pretty comfortable, any additional physical security is probably not going to have an impact. Also, once you reach a certain valued social position, it's hard to entice people to move up and be promoted once they're comfortable. Supervisor support is another thing. So at very low levels, employees have low well-being if they don't have any supervisor support, for the most part, and according to most theories. But as that increases, well-being tends to increase, but only to a certain level, and then it just kind of flattens out. Also, having career outlook. So once you get to a career outlook that's exciting for you and makes you feel like you can get a job, any additional improvements to that aren't really going to have that strong of an impact. And then finally, equity. So you really, really value the fairness of rewards that's based on effort. But at a certain point, you stop caring so much about that because you're already comfortable with the fact that that's happening, and promises of equity no longer motivate employees. So as implied by the vitamin model, some stress can be beneficial. So positive outcomes can arise from something called eustress or good stress or positive stress. So really this is just suggesting that moderate levels of demands motivate employees to expend effort and perform. So it's having a positive impact through healthy stress. Eustress is more likely to occur when one has learned how to react to stress with positive emotions. So a big predictor of having a stressful situation be perceived as eustress and actually result in positive outcomes is having a growth versus a fixed mindset. Someone with a growth mindset sees challenges as an opportunity to improve their skills, whereas people with a fixed mindset do not think additional effort will result in better performance, and they tend to give up when tasks become challenging. Now, it's important to note that no single person always has a growth mindset or always has a fixed mindset. Different situations bring out different mindsets for people. So for example, I feel pretty capable that I can learn how to do just about anything that I want in Microsoft Excel. But as soon as the internet stops working or my computer spontaneously combusts like it did while I was making this lecture, I feel helpless and I immediately call for my husband. So I typically assume that anything I'm going to try to do to fix the problem is not going to work because I just immediately say, I have no idea what's going on. So I have a growth mindset about Microsoft Office, but a fixed mindset about my ability to solve technical issues. So part of that story is my husband, right? So I think it's important to note that enabling can prevent someone from sharpening their growth mindset. So yeah, growing your brain is sometimes uncomfortable. So if you know there's somebody who will do the challenging task for you, you probably won't be as inclined to put forth the effort to stretch your skills. So as a manager, you would want to instill a growth mindset in your employees by explaining the fact that nobody really expects people to be perfect on the job, especially at the beginning. Also, managers can encourage employees to try harder while giving them the resources to do their jobs more efficiently and effectively. Managers should also avoid telling employees that some things are not their area of strength during their performance appraisals. You don't want to assume that employees are trying their best if they're not meeting performance standards. Instead, managers should provide training to help employees meet those standards so that their best becomes better. Now, there's a bunch of research by Carol Dweck, and she suggests that having a growth mindset improves people's performance, wellness, and prospects in life across a variety of domains, in the workplace, at school especially. So on the next slide, you'll see an embedded video that I want you to watch. It's short and it's pretty, and it really is just an animated explanation of a growth versus a fixed mindset. Researchers who study positive psychology really are beginning to appreciate the power of flow. So, flow simply refers to a state of somebody persisting at full capacity and experiencing pleasure from their job. Now, flow tends to occur when individuals receive clear goals and immediate feedback, so getting constructive criticism and supervisor support. So, when individuals feel that their tasks will be challenging enough to stretch their skills, and they are not so challenging that the task is impossible, then the employee is more likely to experience flow. So it's critical that the organization selects employees with the right skills and offers adequate training so that employees will be able to complete tasks and attain goals. So if you look at this graph and you look at along the x-axis, you see skills. So from low to high, having what skill set you have, how skilled you are. And then on the y-axis, from the bottom to top, low to high, the amount of challenge in the job or the tasks associated with the job. Now, at the bottom left-hand corner, you see apathy. So that's a situation where somebody really doesn't have a whole lot of skills and their job isn't really challenging them much. So they're just kind of moping around and they don't really have a sense of purpose in their job. Now, when somebody has high levels of skills, but those skills aren't being flexed in the job and there's no challenge associated with their job, employees tend to become bored, according to flow researchers. So you have all these skills, you're not being able to use them, you're just kind of mentally checked out and disappointed. Now, up at the top here, you see anxiety. So if you don't have a whole lot of skills, but there's a high challenge and high demands in your job, employees tend to experience anxiety. So this is where training becomes extremely important, right? You have to make sure that employees have the tools they need to meet the challenges that you give them. And with respect to boredom, it's important that you make sure that you're matching your employees with the skills that they have so that you can get the maximum potential out of those highly skilled employees and help your organizational performance in general. So if you look at this flow right here, you'll see that it's not a directly up and down rectangle. It's slanted because it's important to note that you want to match skills with challenges. So as skills increase, the level of challenge should increase. And there's really this sweet spot where they have a moderate amount of skills and a moderate amount of challenge, and then it just works them from there as skills and challenges increase. Now I want to introduce you to some specific stressors that are commonly studied in industrial organizational psychology. And I have a feeling that you'll relate to these constructs and understand what it feels like to experience many of these stressors. Role stress consists of environmental demands, constraints, and events that affect an individual's role fulfillment. So, role stress involves perceived characteristics of the expectations of others and perceptions of demands in the work environment. Role stressors tend to have very negative outcomes, such as impaired cognitive functioning, burnout, even sickness. Harmful behaviors can result from role conflict and role stress. Also, lower performance, injuries, and general psychological distress. So you see some common role stressors there, and I'm going to go through each one individually. So role ambiguity really refers to a lack of information from the environment about your duties, objectives, and responsibilities that are needed to fulfill your work role. Role ambiguity often results from changes inside and outside the organization that aren't really communicated well to employees or when people don't agree on the changes. Now, role conflict is two or more sets of incompatible demands concerning work, and there's four different types. So inter-role conflict is the result of incompatible demands between two or more roles of the same person. So for instance, work to family to school conflict is related to all sorts of problems like emotional instability, job dissatisfaction, less family satisfaction, and less school and work satisfaction. So experiencing conflict between your roles as an employee, as a mother or father, and as a student can result in a great deal of stress, as I'm sure many of you know. Now, person role conflict occurs when the organizational requirements clash with someone's personal values and obligations to others. So for instance, a vegan who has to butcher meat to win MasterChef, right? There's some person role conflict there. Their veganism really doesn't lend itself to butchering meat. Then intra-sender role conflict happens when a single role sender, who's usually a supervisor or a peer who has stake in your activities, that person has incompatible expectations. So you have conflicting expectations from a single person. So if the boss is continuously changing performance standards and policies or procedures, you would experience intra-sender role conflict. Then inter-sender role conflict occurs when two or more role senders expect different behaviors. So, for instance, if your boss wants you to fly safely for Grand Canyon tours, but your customers want a thrilling ride, you've got conflicting requests coming from two different people. Inter-sender role conflict is the most common, and I'm sure many of you guys have experienced having conflicting demands from different people in the workplace. Now moving on to role overload. So this is just simply when the demands and constraints of your job cause too much work, or you have too many time pressures or unreasonable deadlines. So role overload occurs when there's a lack of personal resources needed to fulfill duties, commitments, and responsibilities. And a lack of personal resources can be based on time limitations or based on a lack of qualifications and training. So role overload can either come from an objectively ridiculous amount of work or the inability to perform that work or a combination of the two. Now, there are certain characteristics about the environment or the individual that can help minimize the effect of role stressors on employee outcomes. So some of the environmental moderators of role stress are social support. So stress is really inherently social because stress usually comes from other people's demands, expectations, and messages. So being embedded in a supportive social structure or having people who care about you and share empathy and provide resources for you, this strongly reduces the impact of role stress. So if you have help, being taxed is not as harmful to your productivity and well-being. Now moving on to job control. So having control over your work allows you to have autonomy and be able to participate in decision making and experience empowerment. Job control may have stronger mitigating effects on job stress for particular individuals who enjoy power and control. So think about the need for power in McClelland's achievement motivation theory from the motivation lecture. Now there's some individual differences that are important to look at when it comes to having an impact on the relationship between role stress and the negative outcomes. So hardiness is a really important individual characteristic that really is all about stress resistance. So having a sense of control over your life and feeling challenged, not threatened by change. Hardiness really just reflects a desire to meet challenges. Self-efficacy is another individual difference that has an impact on the relationship between role stress and outcomes. So remember, self-efficacy is just kind of like the cognitive evaluation of your ability to perform tasks. So those with more self-efficacy tend to persist with coping efforts and experience reduced strain. And finally, negative affect. So people who just have a stable tendency to experience negative perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, probably going to feel that way regardless of the demands in life. Now I want to introduce you to various types of perceived injustice in the workplace. So distributive justice is all about the perceived fairness, not necessarily the happiness of desired rewards and resources. So distributive justice in the workplace is often based on equity or asking yourself if rewards are fair based on effort. Just like the equity theory of motivation, people compare themselves to similar others to judge whether or not the rewards and resources they receive are fair and equitable. And it's important to note that there are individual differences with respect to how people judge distributive justice. So like I already mentioned, equity is often the preferred basis of rewards in the workplace, but some circumstances may result in people preferring need-based rewards or the equal distribution of rewards. Often people who stand to benefit from need-based or equal distribution of rewards in the workplace tend to prefer that over an equity-based reward system. So think about group projects in school, right? People who tend to slack off in these situations would probably prefer that everybody in the group gets the same grade as opposed to individual merit-based grade. They would prefer an equality basis for distributive justice. Now moving on to procedural justice. So most people are pretty accepting of unfavorable outcomes as long as the process used to determine those outcomes is seen as fair. So this really emphasizes the perceived fairness of policies and procedures. And this emphasis is similar to having participation in decision making from the transactional attributional model of stress. Now moving on to interactional justice. So this is all about interpersonal treatment during the enactment of procedures. Interactional justice can also be very interpersonal in nature, so being treated with politeness and esteem, or really just having positive interactions at work. Interactional justice can also be related to having access to information or receiving adequate information about events and processes that are important to you. So interactional justice can also be related to kind of being in the loop. Now, one model of the perceived impact or the impact of perceived injustice suggests that considerations about the fairness of rewards have an impact on how fair you feel procedures were to arrive at those decisions about your rewards. Perceived fairness of rewards also has an impact on how positive your interactions are at work, according to this model. So if you feel that policies and procedures are fair and you have positive interactions in the workplace, then you experience less burnout and more engagement, according to this model. And also according to this model, if you feel that you have more engagement and more positive perceptions of justice, then you would be more likely to go above and beyond the minimum requirements for performance at work. So having organizational citizenship behaviors when you're highly engaged because you perceive a lot of fairness in the workplace. Another type of injustice is psychological contract breach. So, employers really make an unofficial psychological contract with employees through setting expectations and making promises of desired job conditions, like the fair distribution of resources or allowing employees to participate in decision making. Now, according to Rousseau, psychological contracts involve an individual's belief and perceptions concerning the mutual obligations between employees and employers. So, if an employee was promised certain desired resources or job conditions, and those are not provided, or if an employee fulfills a promise that is not returned later when an employee needs a favor or quid pro quo, then that employee will likely experience psychological contract breach, or in other words, a mismatch between one's expectations and reality. Rousseau suggests that psychological contracts are really grounded in an individual's expectations of the employment relationship. Well, because these expectations form early and are difficult to change, new employee socialization and orientation is really the key to minimizing this potential for violated expectations. So, giving people a realistic job preview and helping them feel like things are fair and getting them in the loop really helps. Rousseau also stresses the fact that individual differences change perceptions of psychological contract. So, different personality types or different ideas about returning favors, and even self serving bias or, constantly overestimating your own contributions. All these things have an impact on whether or not employees feel that certain organizational decisions and procedures are unfair or violate what was promised. Individual differences also predict whether or not psychological contract breach will result in an emotional reaction. So, research suggests that psychological contract is really the cognitive, or social psychological contract breach is really the cognitive awareness of unmet expectations, whereas violation is the emotional reaction or experience of distress, betrayal, or harm as a result of those unmet expectations. And individuals who are more sensitive to equity or who are more worried about fairness, and individuals who feel out of control of the situation tend to experience stronger emotional reactions or violation as the result of psychological contract breach. Research also suggests that psychological contract breach has many negative outcomes. For example, a study that I conducted with faculty members and staff at Washington State University during the economic crisis and some serious budget cuts in academia, this study suggests that individuals who feel that their organization does not live up to its promises and fails to fulfill commitments tend to have less job security, less job satisfaction, more perceived work-family conflict or works interfering with their family, and more burnout. And interestingly, these negative consequences of budget cuts and psychological contract breach appear to be worse when other members of the employee's work group seem to be less affected by threats or demands, or when those around them are experiencing fewer budget cuts. So, in other words, we found that among all participants, employees with higher levels of psychological contract breach and a less affected unit, rather than those experiencing psychological contract breach and a more affected unit, reported the lowest levels of job security and job satisfaction and the highest levels of work-family conflict and burnout. And such outcomes are consistent with social comparison theory, which suggests that experiencing relative deprivation to those who are around you or doing some upward self-comparison will make you feel less satisfied and more stressed. Now let's move on to interpersonal cruelty, which is usually seen in the form of harassment or discrimination based on a person's external characteristics or as generalized workplace aggression. So, in general, workplace aggression is a behavior by an individual or individuals that is intended to physically or psychologically harm an employee within a work-related context. And I'm really only going to focus on psychological aggression, not violence. So aggression from customers is more common than aggression from coworkers, but aggression from coworkers appears to be more damaging to psychological health based on past research. Workplace aggression can be chronic, meaning there's no specific onset, it occurs frequently and ranges in intensity and duration. Or workplace aggression can be acute, meaning that it has a specific onset, it's high intensity with a short duration, and it doesn't happen very often. Research suggests that individual differences actually predict workplace aggression. So frustration, or being a type A personality, or being neurotic, or having alcoholism, or previous experience with aggression and trait anger are all positive predictors of workplace aggression. There are also situational predictors of workplace aggression. So in conditions of injustice, or when there's rapid changes to the organization and there's role ambiguity, or if there's a poor organizational climate or culture, or organizational tolerance of aggression and stressful working conditions, all can have positive impact on workplace aggression and making it happen more often. Now, although it's important to keep in mind that different individuals react to different situations in their own way, research suggests that targets of workplace aggression experience fear, negative moods, cognitive difficulties, anxiety, depression, job satisfaction, and they also targets experience the capacity to do counterproductive work behaviors, so doing things that are damaging to the workplace. They also can engage in revenge, which causes a vicious cycle of targets then targeting other people, and then those targets targeting other people. Now, other than general workplace aggression, harassment refers to negative behaviors that create a hostile environment for specific groups of people. The most commonly reported type of harassment is sexual harassment, and research indicates that behavioral forms of sexual workplace harassment are comprised of three conceptually but distinct categories of behavior. So these include sexual coercion, gender harassment, and unwanted sexual attention. So sexual coercion, or quid pro quo sexual harassment, is considered to be the most severe form of sexual harassment and really just refers to the request of sexual favors directed at a fellow employee as a condition of remaining employed or as a means of gaining a job benefit. Gender harassment refers to targeting an individual or individuals with a range of verbal or nonverbal, insulting, hostile, and degrading behaviors because of their gender. Gender harassment also involves creating a hostile work environment with derogatory symbols or practices that would make any reasonable woman very uncomfortable. So for instance, I had a job once where it was pretty male dominated and there was only a single bathroom and customers weren't allowed to go in there, and there was naked lady pictures on the wall. I was young, I didn't complain, I probably should have. So that's pretty blatant and symbolic, but also maybe if you just have people in the workplace that are questioning the abilities of women simply because they're women, that would be an instance of gender harassment. Now, unwanted sexual attention, as the name implies, refers to behaviors that are of a sexual nature that are unwelcomed by the target. Such behaviors include touching, grabbing, and even crude and offensive sexual remarks that are not of a coercive nature or not trying to get them to do something in return for sex. Research suggests that, as with other forms of workplace aggression, sexual workplace aggression or sexual harassment is related to serious negative outcomes for targets of such behavior. So being harassed can harm your perceptions of worth, your perceived status within the group, your self-esteem, job satisfaction, and general well-being. And research suggests that most types of harassment can be reduced by increasing the diversity of the workforce and through fostering a climate of intolerance for harassment, along with strong punishment for harassing behaviors. So the organization can try to minimize the prevalence of harassment. So for my master's thesis, I actually examined the relative impact of non-sexual workplace aggression and sexual harassment on a ton of different outcomes among military personnel in the reserves. So very few studies have examined non-sexual and sexual workplace aggression in the same study. But the results of my master's thesis examining these experiences together really suggest that non-sexual workplace aggression actually has a stronger relationship with all aspects of job satisfaction that were measured and with affective commitment. However, Sexual harassment appeared to be more strongly related to higher levels of general stress. So non-sexual workplace aggression appears to have a stronger impact on job-related stress, where sexual harassment has a stronger impact on generalized stress. So if you're looking at the model, you can see that that first coefficient that's presented represents the correlation between non-sexual workplace aggression and whatever outcome is being outlined or pointed to. And then the second is the relationship between sexual harassment and the outcome. So numbers closer to 1 are stronger, and all of these coefficients were significant, had less than a 1% chance of occurring due to randomness, except for the relationship between non-sexual workplace aggression and general health. Now let's focus on job insecurity, which for many of us is something that we've had to live with in the face of the economic crisis and the recession in 2008. So, job insecurity is most commonly conceptualized as a subjective or perceptual phenomenon that is best understood and described in the eye of the beholder, and it's often measured by asking employees to indicate the perceived likeliness of losing their job. So from this perspective, job insecurity can be defined as the perception that the future of one's job is unstable or at risk, regardless of any objective level of job security. So regardless of actual impending layoffs or true economic instability. Again, it's in the eye of the beholder. Interestingly, research generally has found that subjective perceptions of job insecurity are more highly related to employee job and health related outcomes than objective job insecurity. So, perception matters a lot, just like the majority of stress theory suggests. Now, there's different types of job insecurity. So, there's the quantitative versus qualitative distinction. So, qualitative job insecurity refers to the potential loss of valued job features, so aspects of the job that you really appreciate that you don't want to lose. Quantitative job insecurity is all about the potential loss of the job itself. And as you can imagine, quantitative job insecurity tends to have a stronger negative impact than qualitative job insecurity or the loss of desired job features. There's also the affective versus cognitive distinction for job insecurity. So, affective job insecurity reflects emotional and attitudinal reactions to potential loss. So, job security satisfaction. So, the concern and the worry and the anxiety. Whereas cognitive job insecurity reflects perceptions regarding the likelihood that the negative changes will occur. So the likelihood that you will lose your job, or you're trying to analyze how likely it is that you'll lose these valued job features. In recent years, researchers have argued that both affective and cognitive job insecurity need to be measured in order to adequately capture the full impact of job insecurity. So much like the other stress models, it's the evaluation of what is happening that then results in an emotional reaction and subsequent outcomes. Job insecurity is a very complex construct, but I developed this simplified comprehensive model of the current state of research on job insecurity that captures the bulk of job insecurity theory and research. So there are 3 sources of job insecurity that also impact the relationship between job insecurity and outcomes. So one of these sources of job insecurity are socioeconomic conditions. So like mass layoff events or national and local unemployment and underemployment rates, and also economic and occupational forecasts are socioeconomic conditions that can have an impact on perceived job insecurity. At a lower level, organizational characteristics. So how well the organization is performing. Maybe if there's a formal announcement of layoffs or an upcoming merger or acquisition, or if there's some organizational restructuring or downsizing taking place, that can have an impact on perceived job insecurity. An additional predictor of job insecurity is technology. So a change in the technological systems of an organization can have a profound effect on job security, especially if the changing technology might result in people becoming unqualified, obsolete, or just disposable. So here's a question to ponder. As more and more jobs are performed by machines, how long do you think it's going to take before we are mostly obsolete? Like, how long do you think our increasingly heavy reliance on technology, how long do you think it'll be before that has a huge impact on our economy and our priorities? It's going to be interesting to watch. So at an even lower level, right, we went from socioeconomic to organizational. Now let's focus on individual characteristics. And there's a variety of individual differences that create an individual's vulnerability to being laid off or experiencing job insecurity. So some of these individual characteristics include employees' personality. So people who are neurotic tend to experience more job insecurity. Also, your employment contract. If you're a temporary employee, well, then you have legitimate job insecurity. Also, your union status. So those in a union tend to feel more safe in their jobs. And the proximity to the organizational core, or how essential your job features are to the organization. Also, your job performance, right? If you're doing a really important job and you're doing it well, you probably don't have a lot of job insecurity. And also just prior layoff experience, right? If you've been burned before, then you may be scared that you could be laid off again. Over 2 decades of research have demonstrated that job insecurity is directly and indirectly related to many consequences that negatively impact employees and organizations. So as you see depicted in the figure on the slide, job insecurity evokes a wide variety of initial reactions and subsequent consequences related to the perceived instability in the continuance of one's job. So research suggests that the perception of job insecurity generates cognitive, affective, and attitudinal reactions, which then result in diminished employee well-being and negative changes in behavior. Now, the vast majority of research has focused on the negative impact of job insecurity on job-related attitudes. So just getting to this point. So two meta-analytic summaries of dozens of studies indicate that job insecurity has a consistent negative relationship with job satisfaction, organizational commitment, and trust in management. And also, job insecurity has a consistent negative relationship with job involvement. Now, it's important to note that the process of job insecurity appears to be cyclical and that job insecurity related behaviors have an impact on the organization, which then facilitates more or less threatening conditions. So now that I've probably depressed you with all of this research and theory about work stress, we're going to focus on ways to mitigate those stressful situations to help employees cope and thrive in organizations. So research suggests that there are several ways to reduce the negative impact of job insecurity. So one way is to offer employees opportunities for more job control and autonomy. So letting them kind of control how they perform their job and maybe be part of the decision-making process when it comes to making organizational policies and procedures regarding their job. Also, autonomy really kind of feeds into control where you kind of just let employees be. You tell them what they need to do and you let them do it as they see fit. You don't stand over them and micromanage them. You give them the autonomy or the freedom to do the job the way they want to do it. Also, another way to alleviate the effects of job insecurity is to foster high quality relationships between supervisors and their employees based on mutual respect, obligation to each other, and trust. If you're trusting your employer, you're not going to feel like your job is threatened as much, and you'll feel like they have your back more if times get tough and people start to get let go. Also, something that's really important is facilitating open two-way communication and flow of information between employees and management, particularly in times of organizational transition. So there's some research out there that shows that even when, times are tough, again, there's budget cuts or the economy is bad and people are going to be let go, if you are transparent about your policies and procedures in the decision-making process, it does help alleviate some of the stress of that experience. And then finally, a great way to alleviate the negative effects of job insecurity is employee participation in organizational decision making. So that gets kind of back to that job control piece where you give employees a voice. You give them that procedural justice where they feel like they have an opportunity to be consulted when it comes to important decisions about them and those around them at the workplace. So many of the ways to cope with job insecurity that I just discussed make sense at the general level too for other types of stress. And most job stress theories agree that job stress results from an interaction between employees and the conditions of the work. So primary prevention of work stress really happens at the organizational level. So employees don't really have direct control over it. And primary prevention of work stress tends to have elements of organizational change and job redesign. So although job characteristics such as autonomy and control are expected to increase job satisfaction and motivation and mental health, research consistently suggests that managers and supervisors are really the key to the primary organizational prevention of stress. They are the frontline people that are interacting with employees, and they can really make or break the work environment. Supervisors are in charge of role clarification or identifying overlapping responsibilities and gaps in responsibilities. So employees with clear roles and are, knowing exactly what's expected of them, experience far less ambiguity or uncertainty and are far more certain that what they're doing is actually the correct course of actions. They feel more confident and more competent. Supervisors are also the frontline intervention for any kind of crisis or conflict. Team building and management can help kind of prevent those crises and conflict. And that helps employees attain career goals because they're not dealing with conflict. They're able to focus on their own career path and have support from supervisors. Also, communication is super critical in the face of any kind of threatening job condition. Supervisors are usually the primary point of contact for communication about mergers or threats of job loss or other circumstances that threaten employees. Also, the design of the objective work environment or the working conditions also can have an impact on job stress. So makes sense, right? Reduced workloads result in decreased anxiety and more job satisfaction and higher levels of performance and less tension than situations where employees are overwhelmed and just have way too much work than they can handle. Also, flex time results in higher performance. Also, less absenteeism and less unpaid sick leave, and better work group relations and higher performance because with flex time, employees have flexibility in deciding when they have to be at the office. They can do a little extra work one day and then cash in another day and get out early. So you can imagine that that's really beneficial for people who have families or other obligations. And also, you can kind of work around the schedule that works best for you. Like for me, I'm not really a morning person, so if I had flex time, I could come in a little late, stay a little late, and be at my best. Also, flex time allows employees to kind of figure out the schedule that works best for them. Also, innovation can reduce the impact of stress by making work processes more efficient. For example, if you give truck drivers a GPS instead of forcing them to rely on physical maps or memorize routes, so you can use technology to mitigate some of the workload and stress. It's also important to consider that not all organizational interventions will work well for all employees. Employers must consider individual differences. You can alter working conditions, but what's less stressful for some may actually be more stressful for others. So supervisors and organizational leaders should be mindful of those individual differences, and if possible, maybe cater different types of interventions to different types of employees. So you can help individuals who are having trouble adapt and cope by introducing them to peers or mentors, and that can really result in more individual attention. So you can also identify individual or group relationships that are stressful and maybe reassign work groups to create better person environment fit. So as a manager or a supervisor, you should kind of have your eyes and ears open to see if there's any kind of toxic relationships happening and maybe do some reassigning or reorganization. Then finally, you want to identify individual training needs and help employees learn the skills they need to do their job well. If you don't know how to do your job, even if you have autonomy and flexibility and a lot of control, you're going to be really stressed out because you're going to feel like you're unable to perform. So far, I've really focused on certain aspects of the job that aren't necessarily in the individual employee's control, unless you're a supervisor or a manager or some sort of organizational leader. But we all know that stress functions primarily at the individual level. If individual demands exceed one's ability or perceived capability to respond to those demands, then stress arises. So individually targeted interventions are focused at developing one's ability or perceived capability to respond to stress on their own. So while the primary level of stress intervention takes place at the organizational level, it's often too costly or disruptive to implement organizational level interventions, especially since those broad interventions may not work well for everybody. So many organizations focus on the secondary level of stress management, which really extends personal resources to avoid strain. So one way to deal with that is health promotion. So help assessments. So you help first or you help people quit smoking, maybe having an exercise center or providing free gym memberships for employees. This results in less sickness, fewer absences, lower healthcare costs, and an improvement in short-term health. Also, stress management training can improve stress resistance. You can have relaxation or meditation, which helps employees kind of collect their thoughts and deal with circumstances or manage negative emotions. And you could pay for that or have somebody come to the company to do that. Also, you could mandate or provide time for exercise. That's a very effective way to reduce stress and has a long-term benefit for health. That always makes me think of the Japanese businessman on top of the building doing calisthenics during the workday, just to reduce stress. Also, cognitive behavioral therapy can be used to reduce irrational anxiety-provoking thoughts if an individual is having severe problems with that in a variety of circumstances that aren't necessarily tied directly to the job. Now we have the tertiary or the third level of stress management. So this involves reactionary measures to strain that already occurred. So you're really responding to something that already happened. So reactionary stress management usually involves counseling, kind of like cognitive behavioral therapy, but more like instead of trying to prevent it, you're trying to deal with it, and employee assistance for treatment of strain resulting from job stress. So many counselors report that most problems are personal, not work related. It's conflicts between people, not necessarily job tasks that get people down. And counseling has more of an impact on overall mental health and really less of an impact on job attitudes. But if you're healthier and you're happier, you're going to bring that to the job as well. So it's really worth investing in if you're an organizational leader to help your employees be at their best. So that is all I have for you for work stress. This is an area of research that I'm deeply interested in, so you'll see there's a ton of references here, and I hope that you found it interesting as well. And again, you aren't kind of depressed or sad. Maybe you can relate to some of this stuff, and maybe some of this stuff will help you deal with the stress that you face on the job as well.